November 27th, 1950, 23:40 hours, Chosun Reservoir, North Korea, 22 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Private First Class James Ransom, 1st Marine Division, crouched in a frozen foxhole carved from ground so hard it had taken 4 men with pickaxes 3 hours to dig 3 feet deep. His M1 Garand rifle lay across his knees, the metal so cold it burned through his gloves when he touched it. Around him, stretched across 13 miles of mountainous terrain surrounding a frozen reservoir, 30,000 United Nations troops were dug in, waiting for dawn. What they didn't know yet was that 120,000 Chinese soldiers were already moving through the darkness, encircling them in temperatures that would kill as efficiently as any bullet. Ransom's hands were numb. His feet had lost feeling 2 hours ago. The C-ration can he'd tried to open for dinner had frozen solid. The contents expanded and split the tin. When he exhaled, his breath crystallized instantly and fell like snow. The morphine syrettes and the medic kits were frozen useless. The batteries and radios died within minutes of exposure. Blood plasma froze in its containers. And in 6 hours, when the Chinese attacked in human waves screaming through the mountain passes, these Marines would discover that their weapons, designed and tested in temperate climates, were about to fail them in ways no one had anticipated. The Korean War, which began in June 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, had seemed almost won by November. General Douglas MacArthur had promised the troops would be home by Christmas. United Nations forces, led primarily by American units, had pushed north almost to the Chinese border at the Yalu River. The plan was simple: finish the North Korean army, occupy the peninsula, go home. What military planners in Washington and Tokyo hadn't adequately prepared for was fighting a winter campaign in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Korea's northern mountains, where the Chosun Reservoir operation was taking place, experienced some of the coldest temperatures ever recorded in combat operations. While the Pacific theater of World War II had taught American forces about jungle warfare, and the European theater had provided experience with cold weather, nothing had prepared the military for sustained operations in temperatures that regularly dropped to 30 and 40 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, with wind chills pushing past 50 below. The equipment issued to troops was largely the same used in Europe 5 years earlier, designed for winter conditions, but not for the extreme cold of North Korea's mountains. The result was a perfect storm of environmental factors that would make the Korean War one of the most physically punishing conflicts American soldiers ever endured. Private Ransom had arrived in Korea in October, part of the massive buildup following the Incheon landing. He was 19 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania where winter meant snow and temperatures in the 20s. Cold, but manageable. Nothing like this. His unit had been issued standard winter gear: wool uniforms, field jackets, leather boots, cotton gloves. On paper, adequate for winter operations. In practice, catastrophically insufficient. The wool uniforms, while providing some insulation when dry, absorbed moisture from sweat and snow, then froze solid. Men's uniforms would literally stand up by themselves when removed. The field jackets, designed with a cotton outer shell, offered minimal wind protection. At 40 below zero with mountain winds gusting to 30 miles per hour, the wind chill factor made exposure lethal within minutes. The leather boots, which had served adequately in European winters, became death traps in Korea. They weren't insulated enough for extreme cold. They weren't waterproof enough to keep out snowmelt, and most critically, they were sized to fit snugly. In extreme cold, feet swell. Tight boots restrict circulation. Restricted circulation means frostbite. By the end of November 1950, the 1st Marine Division alone was reporting more cold weather casualties than combat casualties. Men were losing toes, feet, fingers, hands, noses, ears. Frostbite was so prevalent that medical officers had to establish triage categories: superficial frostbite that could be treated in the field, deep frostbite requiring evacuation, and frostbite so severe that amputation was inevitable. The cold affected everything: weapons, carefully engineered and tested, became unreliable or completely inoperable. The M1 Garand rifle, the standard American infantry weapon, used a gas-operated system where propellant gases from a fired round cycled the action to eject the spent casing and chamber a new round. The lubricating oil used in these weapons was designed for temperate climates. In extreme cold, it thickened into a gel, then solidified completely. When a Marine pulled the trigger, the rifle might fire once, but the action wouldn't cycle. The weapon became a single-shot rifle, requiring manual operation of the bolt after each round. In combat against human wave attacks where hundreds of Chinese soldiers were charging positions, this was catastrophic. Browning automatic rifles, the squad-level automatic weapons that provided suppressive fire, experienced the same failures. The recoil springs, made of steel that became brittle in extreme cold, would snap. Machine guns would fire a few rounds, then jam. Mortars, critical for indirect fire support, had their own problems. The mortar tubes contracted in the cold, changing the tolerances enough that rounds wouldn't always seat properly. Worse, the propellant charges that launched the mortar rounds were affected by temperature. A charge that would send a round 200 yards at 70 degrees Fahrenheit might only send it 800 yards at 30 below zero. Fire direction calculations became guesswork. Artillery faced similar issues, with hydraulic fluid and recoil mechanisms freezing solid, rendering the guns inoperable until they could be thawed. But weapons failures, as catastrophic as they were, represented only one category of the nightmare facing American forces in Korea's winter. Medical care, which had advanced dramatically during World War II, regressed to Civil War levels in the Korean cold. Morphine syrettes, small single-dose tubes of pain medication that medics carried to treat wounded soldiers, froze solid. Medics tried keeping them warm by carrying them in their armpits or inside their uniforms, but in sustained operations in extreme cold, even body heat wasn't enough. Wounded men suffered without pain relief. Blood plasma, used for treating shock and blood loss, froze in its containers. Even when medics could get plasma thawed enough to administer, the tubing used for intravenous lines would freeze, stopping the flow. Bandages froze to wounds. When medics tried to change dressings, they would tear away frozen blood and tissue, causing additional trauma. Wounded men, already in shock from their injuries, would go into deeper shock from exposure. The standard treatment for shock is to keep the patient warm. In 40 below temperatures with no heated facilities, this was impossible. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable in any other environment, not because medical care was inadequate, but because the environment made that care impossible to deliver effectively. If you want to discover how American forces overcame these impossible conditions to fight their way out of the Chosin Reservoir, in what military historians call one of the greatest fighting retreats in history, please leave your like on this video. This helps YouTube share these forgotten stories with more people. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. We rescue stories like this from the archives every day. Transportation and logistics, the backbone of any military operation, collapsed in the Korean winter. Vehicles designed and tested in temperate climates failed in catastrophic ways. Jeeps, the versatile light vehicles used for everything from reconnaissance to casualty evacuation, wouldn't start when temperatures dropped below zero. The batteries, already weakened by cold, couldn't provide enough current to turn over engines with oil that had thickened to the consistency of molasses. Even when vehicles could be started, they faced other problems. Radiator fluid, if not properly mixed with antifreeze, would freeze and crack engine blocks. Fuel lines would freeze. Tire rubber became brittle and would crack or shatter. Tracked vehicles like tanks and personnel carriers had their own issues. The steel tracks would freeze to the ground overnight. Crews would have to light fires under the vehicles to thaw them before they could move. The engines, even with proper cold weather oil, would take hours to warm up enough to operate reliably. Transmissions would seize. Hydraulic systems would fail. A tank battalion that should have been able to move 50 miles in a day might manage 5 miles, with half the vehicles breaking down en route. Supply trucks, trying to navigate mountain roads covered in ice and snow, would slide off cliffs or get stuck in drifts. Supplies that did make it forward arrived frozen. Rations were inedible blocks of ice. Water in jerry cans was solid. Medical supplies were compromised by freezing. The food situation became desperate. C rations, the canned meals that were standard field rations, would freeze solid. The cans would split as their contents expanded. Even intact cans were nearly impossible to open with fingers too numb to operate can openers. Men tried heating rations over small fires, but in combat conditions, fires drew enemy fire. Some soldiers tried keeping ration cans inside their uniforms to prevent freezing, but this only worked if they were constantly moving and generating body heat. In static defensive positions, everything froze. Hot meals, prepared at rear area kitchens and transported forward in insulated containers, would be frozen solid by the time they reached frontline units. Men were burning more than 5 Zordon calories per day, just trying to stay warm in the extreme cold, but were consuming maybe 2,000 calories of frozen, partially eaten rations. Weight loss was dramatic. Men would lose 20, 30, 40 pounds over the course of weeks. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Respiratory infections spread rapidly through units living in unheated positions. Pneumonia became epidemic. Men were fighting the Chinese, the cold, starvation, and disease simultaneously. Water, something so basic that military planners rarely worried about it, became a critical problem. In the Korean winter, every water source froze. Streams, rivers, even the Chosin Reservoir itself was covered with ice feet thick. Men couldn't drink the ice directly. Eating snow or ice lowers core body temperature and accelerates hypothermia. Water had to be melted, which required heat, which required fuel, which was in short supply. Units would assign men to do nothing but melt snow over small stoves, a process that took hours to produce enough drinking water for a squad. Canteens froze solid. Men learned to keep canteens inside their uniforms. But this only worked for so long. Dehydration became a serious issue. In extreme cold, the body loses moisture through respiration at an accelerated rate. That crystallized breath that formed every time someone exhaled represented water loss. Men needed to drink constantly to stay hydrated, but water wasn't available. Dehydrated soldiers had thicker blood, which made them more susceptible to frostbite. They had reduced cognitive function, making mistakes in combat. They had reduced physical performance, moving slower, thinking slower, reacting slower. The Chinese forces, who were also suffering from the cold but were better acclimated and had shorter supply lines, could exploit this weakness. The psychological impact of the cold was as devastating as the physical impact. Men who had faced combat in World War II, who had stormed beaches and fought through hedgerows and survived artillery barrages, said the Korean winter was worse than anything they'd experienced. The cold was an enemy that never stopped attacking. It was there when you woke up, if you'd managed to sleep at all. It was there all day. It was there all night. It never retreated, never gave you a break, never let up. Men became obsessed with warmth. They would take insane risks for the promise of a few minutes near a fire. They would volunteer for patrols just to keep moving and generate body heat. In defensive positions, men would huddle together for warmth. 3 or 4 men pressed against each other in a foxhole trying to share body heat. Sleep became nearly impossible. You couldn't sleep in the cold because you'd freeze to death. Men would doze for a few minutes, wake up shivering violently, move around to warm up, doze again. After days of this, cognitive function deteriorated. Men would hallucinate. They would make mistakes. Officers reported that men would simply stop functioning, staring blankly, unable to process orders or respond to situations. This wasn't cowardice or combat fatigue in the traditional sense. This was the human brain shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature and basic survival. Communication systems failed in the cold. Radio batteries, as mentioned earlier, died within minutes of exposure. Units tried keeping radios inside warming tents, only bringing them out when needed. But this wasn't always possible in fluid combat situations. When radios did work, the cold affected the operators. Fingers too numb to operate controls properly. Lips and tongues too cold to speak clearly. Messages became garbled. Misunderstandings multiplied. Units lost contact with higher headquarters. Companies lost contact with their platoons. Platoons lost contact with their squads. In the chaos of the Chosin Reservoir fighting, where 30,000 UN troops were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese in mountainous terrain, communication failures meant units were fighting isolated battles, unaware of what was happening a few hundred yards away. Field telephones, which used wire lines strung between positions, had their own problems. The insulation on the wires became brittle in the cold and would crack. Moisture would get into the cracks and freeze, breaking the connection. Repair crews would spend hours trying to find breaks in miles of wire strung through mountains in the dark, while under fire. Even when lines were intact, the sound quality was so poor that messages were often unintelligible. Do any of you have a grandfather, a father, an uncle who served in Korea and never talked about what he lived through? These stories are disappearing. Leave a comment right now saying just, "My grandfather served," or "My father served." When you comment, you're not just honoring your family. You're preserving memory for the next generations. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. The Chinese forces, while also suffering from the cold, had several advantages. They were fighting closer to their supply lines. They were acclimated to the region's climate. They had winter clothing more suitable for extreme cold, including quilted cotton uniforms that provided better insulation than American wool. They had felt boots that were warmer than American leather boots. They had fur hats with ear flaps. But more importantly, they had tactical adaptations. Chinese commanders knew their troops couldn't sustain prolonged firefights in the cold. Weapons would fail. Men would freeze. So they developed tactics around short, violent attacks. They would infiltrate close to American positions during darkness, using the terrain and the cold to mask their approach. Then, they would attack in human waves, overwhelming positions through sheer numbers before American firepower could be brought to bear. Effectively, they would fight for 30 minutes, an hour, then withdraw before American artillery and air support could respond. These tactics exploited every weakness the cold created in American forces. Weapons that jammed after a few shots couldn't stop human wave attacks. Communications failures meant units couldn't call for support quickly. Vehicle failures meant reinforcements couldn't arrive in time. The Chinese were turning the environment into a weapon. November 27, 1950. The night Private Ransom was crouched in his frozen foxhole was the beginning of the Chinese offensive at Chosin Reservoir. Around 2200 hours, Chinese forces began their attack. Bugles sounded in the darkness, a psychological weapon designed to unnerve defenders. Then came the whistles, the shouting, and the waves of soldiers. Ransom's first indication of the attack was the sound of firing from positions to his left. Then he saw them, shadows moving through the darkness, dozens of them, hundreds of them. He raised his M1 Garand, aimed at the nearest shadow, and pulled the trigger. The rifle fired. The recoil kicked against his shoulder. He worked the bolt manually, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a new round. The gas system had frozen. His rifle was now a bolt-action weapon. He fired again, worked the bolt, fired, worked the bolt. Around him, other Marines were experiencing the same failures. The volume of fire that should have stopped the Chinese attack was reduced to a fraction of its normal level. The Browning automatic rifle team to Ransom's right got off a burst of 6 rounds before their weapon jammed completely. The machine gun position behind them fired for maybe 10 seconds before it seized up. The Chinese kept coming. What saved the Marines at Chosin wasn't superior firepower or better equipment. It was training, discipline, and sheer determination. When rifles jammed, Marines fixed them. They would urinate on the bolts to melt the frozen oil, then work the action until it moved freely. They would hold rifles inside their parkas to warm them enough to function. They would field strip weapons in the middle of firefights, removing all lubricant, running them dry. A dry weapon would wear out faster, but it would function in the cold. When automatic weapons failed, Marines used them as single-shot rifles. When mortars couldn't provide fire support, Marines used grenades. When grenades froze and wouldn't arm properly, Marines used bayonets. The fighting at Chosin Reservoir lasted 17 days. Temperatures never rose above 0 Fahrenheit. Most days it was 20 to 30 below. The 1st Marine Division, along with Army units and British Royal Marine Commandos, fought their way 78 miles from Udamni, on the west side of the reservoir, to the port of Hungnam on the coast. They were surrounded the entire way. They were outnumbered 4 to 1. They were fighting in the worst conditions American forces had ever experienced. They brought out their wounded. They brought out their dead. They brought out their equipment. General Oliver P. Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, famously said, "Gentlemen, we are not retreating. We are merely attacking in another,